Hello and welcome to Twist List. Today we are looking at Top 10 Unauthorized US Wars. US President Donald Trump recently ordered a Tomahawk missile strike against the Assad regime in Syria without first seeking congressional authorization. This has generated controversy regarding the legal powers of the presidency. According to the US Constitution, the president can only use military force offensively once Congress has declared war on an adversary. The 1973 War Powers Act provided a more flexible alternative, stating that the president could order the military to engage in offensive action for a period of 60 days. After that, the president would have to ask Congress for an authorization for use of military force. However, history is full of examples where the president, for various reasons, was able to go to war without any approval from Congress at all. Number 6 on the list is 7. Tensions between Manuel Noriega, the military leader of Panama, and the United States deteriorated throughout the 1980s. The US government accused Noriega of helping drug smugglers in exchange for kickbacks. The final straw came in December 1989 when Noriega's paramilitary forces guarding a checkpoint fired upon a group of US naval officers stationed in the Panama Canal Zone, killing one. In retaliation, President George H.W. Bush ordered an invasion of Panama, which quickly neutralized Noriega's military. Cut off from all avenues of escape, Noriega fled to the Vatican embassy in Panama City. US troops responded by blasting heavy rock into the embassy, and Noriega surrendered 2 weeks later. The intervention was extremely popular both within Congress and among the general public. Since Operation Just Cause was concluded in only 42 days, President Bush beat out the 60-day clock established by the War Powers Act and never had to seek formal congressional authorization. 5. The 5th spot on the list is occupied by 1941. The Libyan civil war started in February 2011 after dictator Muammar Gaddafi's security forces began executing Arab Spring protesters who called for his resignation. Although the rebels quickly seized the city of Benghazi, Gaddafi's troops soon appeared poised to retake the city and unleash a retaliatory bloodbath. Citing a UN Security Council resolution to protect civilians and impose a no-fly zone, NATO forces began a concerted air campaign against Gaddafi. This quickly turned the tide of war in favor of the rebels. President Barack Obama did not seek congressional authorization before launching airstrikes. He argued that the War Powers Act did not apply because the US military was intervening in support of NATO rather than fighting alone. Congress did not accept this explanation but had no way of forcing Obama to withdraw. Ultimately, the air campaign ended in October 2011 after Gaddafi was caught hiding in a drain pipe and was killed under mysterious circumstances. The Libyan intervention is extremely controversial today, partly because of the 2012 assassination of the US ambassador in Benghazi. 6. Number 4 on the list is Operation Just Cause. The Kosovo War began as an insurgency by Kosovo Liberation Army paramilitaries who sought independence from the Serbian-dominated Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. In retaliation, the Yugoslav army responded with a heavy-handed attempt to stamp out the insurgency, massacring civilians and creating a refugee crisis. NATO began a bombing campaign to evict the Yugoslav army from Kosovo after international attempts to broker a political settlement failed. Interestingly, President Clinton requested an authorization for the use of military force in Kosovo, which was passed by the Senate. However, the same authorization failed to pass the House after a rare 213 to 213 tie. 7. Clinton continued bombing the Yugoslav army anyway. He argued that Congress had appropriated funding for the intervention, which was basically the same as authorizing it. The Yugoslav army was forced to withdraw from Kosovo, which eventually gained its independence. At the third place we have 5. In 1916, the Mexican warlord Pancho Villa launched a raid against the border town of Columbus, New Mexico. It was in retaliation for U.S. support for Venustiano Carranza, Villa's rival in the ongoing Mexican Revolution. Although Villa's forces were repulsed from Columbus with heavy losses, the U.S. public was outraged. President Woodrow Wilson ordered General John J. Pershing and a division of U.S. troops to pursue Villa into Mexico to kill or capture him. 8. The expedition was justified from a legal standpoint as a defensive action due to Villa's raid on Columbus. Thus, no declaration of war was required. However, as the term punitive expedition would suggest, the intervention was aimed not only at securing U.S. borders but also at retaliation. The expedition marched over 800 kilometers, 500 miles, into Mexico and inflicted severe losses on Villa's forces. However, U.S. forces were ultimately forced to withdraw due to Carranza's objections that Mexican sovereignty was being violated. This allowed Villa to escape. At the second spot is 2011. President Ronald Reagan initiated Operation Urgent Fury in October 1983 as a result of ongoing instability in the Marxist-controlled island of Grenada. The Prime Minister of Grenada had recently been executed in a violent coup, and the new government imposed a strict 24-hour curfew enforced by summary execution. Fearing that U.S. medical students on the island would be harmed, Reagan ordered an invasion. An air assault quickly captured the only 2 airports on the island despite heavy resistance from the Grenadians and their Cuban military advisors. 9. Major combat operations concluded within 3 days, the Grenadian government was replaced, and all U.S. students were rescued safely. When asked why he did not seek congressional authorization, President Reagan argued that he had to act decisively to save the lives of the medical students. In any event, the speed of the invasion meant that Congress was presented with a fait accompli. The intervention was condemned internationally as a violation of Grenada's sovereignty but was extremely popular at home. It even inspired a Clint Eastwood movie, Kosovo War. In June 1950, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung ordered a massive invasion of South Korea. This caught both the South Koreans and the United States completely by surprise. President Harry Truman was initially reluctant to send U.S. troops to Korea, fearing that this would lead the Soviets and Chinese to also intervene. Then, in one of the greatest diplomatic blunders in history, the Soviets boycotted a UN Security Council meeting to protest that Mao's communist government had not been given China's Security Council seat despite winning the Chinese Civil War. The Security Council passed a resolution asking UN member states to assist South Korea. The Soviets were unable to veto it due to their absence. 10. President Truman used the UN resolution as a justification for US intervention and drove back the North Koreans. Although the Korean War dragged on for 3 more years in a lengthy stalemate, Truman never requested a declaration of war from Congress. He argued that the war was legally covered by the UN resolution. Henry is a graduate of the Johns Hopkins University. He currently lives and works in Washington, D.C.
Number 4 on the list is, newspaper editors had to carry guns. Most people are familiar with the practice of dueling, which was prevalent in 18th century colonial America and perhaps made famous by the later duel between political rivals Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. During a time in which the free press was just starting to flourish, people were not so used to having their character or political viewpoints attacked as viciously and publicly as the wide distribution of the printing press allowed. This often put newspaper editors quite literally in the line of fire. Newspapers during the time were very biased in their political viewpoints, and as a result, editors were challenged to duels so often that they had to keep a firearm with them at all times, even at the office, just in case an irate reader charged in and demanded a duel. 6. At the third place we have, Nova Scotia could have been considered the 14th colony. Before the Revolutionary War, there really was no conception of the 13 colonies as Americans know them today. There was simply British North America, of which Nova Scotia was a part. 3/4 of Nova Scotia's population were New Englanders, and on a few occasions, various Nova Scotian groups attempted to join the American Revolution through acts of insurrection and correspondence with Patriot leaders. For example, a shipment of hay to be used in Boston as forage against American rebels was burned in Halifax before it could be loaded onto the ship. 7. A group of Nova Scotian emissaries also traveled to Boston in order to meet with the Continental Congress and convince George Washington to invade Nova Scotia. Washington denied their request, perhaps because his last offensive attempt in Quebec had gone so poorly. The Nova Scotian rebels did, however, go on to launch a few military actions back home but were ultimately unsuccessful. The campaign is known in Canada as Eddie's Rebellion. At the second spot is, Thomas Jefferson consumed opium habitually. Many see the opioid crisis of the United States today as a fairly new one, but the history of opium in the US stretches back much further. In fact, the Founding Fathers themselves had their own encounters with the drug. By now, because of recent pushes to legalize marijuana, we all know that Thomas Jefferson grew hemp on his plantation, but fewer people know he grew opium as well. Because opium is an effective antidiarrheal, Jefferson turned to it later in life because of his, chronic diarrhea. He often used what was an early form of laudanum, an alcoholic solution containing opium. Jefferson felt so much better on the drug that he once wrote to a friend describing his use of laudanum as habitual. 8. And finally, at number 1, politics were very, very uncivil. A lot is made of the incivility in American politics today, with people pining for a time in which political parties and politicians from opposite sides of the political spectrum treated each other with respect, but this is simply a misrepresentation of politics in the United States. You may not have had televised presidential debates in which candidates talked about the size of their genitalia, but this is only because there wasn't television, and there weren't yet public presidential debates. Otherwise, the most powerful politicians were most certainly discussing their genitalia in public forums. John Adams, for example, once wrote of Alexander Hamilton, "What a pity it is that our Congress had not known this discovery, and that Alexander Hamilton's project of raising an army of 50,000 men, 10,000 of them to be cavalry, and his projects of sedition laws and alien laws and of new taxes to support his army, all arose from a superabundance of secretions which he could not find whores enough to draw off. And that the same vapors produced his lies and slanders by which he totally destroyed his party forever and finally lost his life in the field of honor." 9. All of this is to ignore the fact that people would actually shoot each other over political differences, such as that most famous instance in which Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel.
If you enjoyed
So
this
pine not
video
for
and
the
would like
so-called
to see
civil
more,
days of
then
American
please hit the
politics,
subscribe
unless
button.
you wish to see a duel between two candidates, which is a bad example because we would all definitely watch that on TV. Kevin Klatman is a stand-up comedian, writer, and actor from Colorado. He has performed stand-up all over the United States and has acted in a bevy of commercials and will also appear in the upcoming movie The Wilderness Pilot. His writing has been featured in The Hard Times, Listverse, and Savage Henry magazine.